I have the privilege of telling the story of a revival that happened in a very small country town in a place called Smithton. The town itself only had 531 people there. And there was a small church at the time being pastored by a gentleman called Steve Gray. I had the privilege of attending this church 20 years later. So the revival broke out in 1996. But let me backtrack a bit. So Steve Gray had been pastoring a little church of about 80 people in this little town. And like many leaders had suffered betrayal, but there was one too many. And he had left his church, he'd left his wife, he was ready to totally give up on everything. And he gave it one last shot. He was a desperate man, and he took himself to the Brownsville revival in 1996. Very, very broken man. And God whispered to him one night a glimmer of hope. And the hope was that he was asking Steve to go back and would he host revival. The background story to this is astounding. What happened while he was away, the men of the church were so broken that their pastor had to leave to get help. They got on their knees and they wept and they cried before the Lord and repented that they had not been who they should have been, and they asked God for revival. See, they'd spent 12 years praying, but there was something that had missed. When those men prayed for revival is when God answered the heart cry of Steve. 2 weeks after he'd left, he returned to that small place in that small white weatherboard church in Smithton, walked in the back door at 6:12 p.m. As soon as he walked in, the presence of God hit like they'd never experienced before. And there were many miracles that began to happen, and there were healings and supernatural, to the point where within the next 3 years, that little town of 531 people had 250,000 visitors because they heard what God was doing. Why did that start? Because people were hungry and desperate for God, and those men got on their faces, repented, wept, and they prayed for God to change. And He did. Why do I tell this story? Because I have visited that place, Smithton, and in Kansas City, which it has now moved to. We stood in that church only about 18 months ago, and the presence of God is still carried 20 years later. What was the key? They have learnt how to honor the presence of God and honor one another, and they pray. My goodness, when they pray, heaven shifts and moves. So I wanted to share that modern time revival story with you, because I have set my feet in that place, and I have wept on that stage for Australia to experience the same thing. And I believe God hears us when we pray.